Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today's video is another linguistics teaching lecture video. Today's topic is child language acquisition. So, how do children learn their first language or languages? If you are watching this video, then you have presumably acquired a language, whether English is your native language or one of several that you speak. You probably don't remember learning your first language. You were practically fluent in your first language before your memories even really began. However, if you have experience learning a second or third or fourth language later in life, you will probably know that this is much more difficult. Why this is much more difficult really is still a bit of a mystery to linguists, and how babies are so good at acquiring language is a little bit of a mystery. There are some theories, but they are just theories, and some of them are in contention with each other. But today we'll be talking about how children go about acquiring language. I have some slides that we will flip through. So without any further ado, let's get straight to it. So as always, I've printed out some slides to talk about child language acquisition. And so let's start by looking at big picture questions in developmental psycholinguistics. This cute little baby right here in the process of acquiring his or her first language. So some big questions are: what are the stages and processes that children go through in development of language? And what are the consequences of these findings for linguistic theories in general and for understanding how the human mind works? So we can learn a lot about the nature of language by studying how children or babies acquire language. And what we learn about how people acquire their native language has some pretty big implications for our theories about language as a whole. So to start off, let's get a couple things cleared away. Number one, children learn the language of the communities in which they are raised. This means that it is necessary that you are surrounded and exposed to a language in order to acquire it natively as a child. Number two, there is no genetic basis for the language or dialect a child ends up speaking. This means that although it is believed that there is some genetic component to language production as a whole, the specific language that a child ends up learning is not genetically predetermined. So, just because your parents or grandparents speak a language, that does not mean that you will speak that language if you are not exposed to it. Children of immigrant families will know this well. If your parents speak one language and then move to an area where a different language is spoken, immigrant children or the children of these families may or may not acquire their parents' language depending on the level of exposure they have to that language. We see the same thing with adopted children. Just because their biological parents spoke a language does not mean that they will speak that same language if they are not exposed to it. And children all over the world go through similar stages in the development of language. So we will talk about some specific stages that English-speaking children go through. However, children all over the world go through similar stages in their language acquisition process, which indicates that there's something similar going on in the brain of children all over the world. My work printer decided to staple these slides, and I don't know if it's going to be the most efficient way. Okay, now we can look at these one slide at a time. So, some basic observations. One is that children learn to speak without explicitly being taught. So, children learn via exposure, but they don't have to be sat down and told, this is how you use the, this is how you use a, this is how you use ing. They pick it up via exposure. 2. All typically developing children learn a language successfully through normal exposure. So, of course, there are some conditions that may make it so that a child has difficulty or is unable to acquire language. However, all typically developing children can learn a language just through exposure itself. And 3, children learn very rapidly. Think about how long it takes you to acquire a language fluently or to a native-like level if you are starting as an adult, and compare that to how quickly children can become fluent speakers of their native language. So here are some stages of language acquisition, and these are not English specific. In fact, all children around the world go through similar stages of language acquisition. From birth to 8 weeks is the newborn or reflexive stage. So in this, newborns' reflexes are very well tuned. You'll see things like the palmar grasp reflex. Other reflexes, however, they aren't really making much in terms of language production. Of course, they're crying, they are making noise, but it's not very akin to language yet. However, even really quickly, we start to see children differentiate the sounds they make. So for 2 to 4 months, this is still a very fresh baby, but 2 to 4 months old, we will see that children start using different kinds of cries for different purposes. They'll make gurgling sounds, squealing sounds, cooing sounds. At 4 to 6 months, children exhibit what we call vocal play. So these are consonant-like sounds and then syllables, ba, ma, pa, ra, ta, etc. 7 to 9 months, there is repeated or canonical babbling, which also starts to show intonation. So repeated or canonical babbling is just repeating one syllable over and over and over. Ba, 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 ba. Ma, 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 ma. But they start to show intonation that we would expect to see in adult speakers. Ba, 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 ba. could be a question. Mama, mama, ma is something like a declarative utterance. So children start to copy the intonation that they hear really, really young. Ba 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 ba, ba 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 ba. They start to play with the intonation and pitch of how they're speaking. 10 to 11 months, we start to see variegated babbling. So this is not repeating just one syllable over and over, but switching up the syllables. It's not quite a word yet, but they are continuing to test out their vocal tract. They're learning how to use their tongue and their lips and their vocal cords in order to make sounds, and they're starting to switch up the sounds when they babble. At 12 months, most typically developing infants are at the one-word stage. They can produce one word at a time. Mama, dada, kika for cat, or something, it might be a reduced pronunciation, so not fully saying cat, dog, house, but approximations of those words can start to come out at the 12-month stage, or at 12 months old. And then from 12 months to 4 years old, children's language acquisition skyrockets, just really takes off. So for 12 to 18 months, they are in the one-word stage. At 18 to 24 months, they are in the two-word stage. So they could have a noun-like word with a predicate-like word. So Blinky, give, mama, go, babies, milk, things like that. They can do possessives, verbs, etc. At 2 years old, they can speak in phrases, short sentences, and simple questions. They still may be in, some of these may be 2-word questions, 3-word questions, not very long sentences, but they can start to string words together to make a more complex phrase. At 3 years old, babies start to acquire, or I guess toddlers start to acquire things like prepositions, pronouns, and can create sequences of 2 to 3 sentences. So they are making longer utterances. They have these grammatical, not content words, but function words in the box, on the table, things like that. They can start to use pronouns like she, he, they, it, whereas babies younger than 3 years old tend to speak in the third person. They may not have learned I or me yet. They might say things like baby go, baby hungry, baby want, because they don't have I or me in their vocabulary yet. At 4 years old, children have acquired basic grammar rules. They can tell stories. They can use regular inflection. So this means inflectional morphemes, things like tense. They can use ed to create past tense verbs. They may not know irregular verbs like eat becomes ate. They might say eat becomes eated. But they have acquired regular things like regular tenses, regular plurals. And they might have some irregular forms, like they might know I am, he is, they are. But they probably don't have the rarer irregular forms. They probably don't know that dive becomes dove, or mice or mouse becomes mice. they might say mouse and mouses because they've learned the regular plural but not the irregular plurals. So, previously we have talked about phonology in other videos on this channel. So let's talk a little bit about acquisition of phonology. How do babies acquire the sounds of their language and start to put them into patterns? Or how do they start to recognize the patterns of sounds in their language? And also, what pronunciations are childlike and which pronunciations are adult-like? So, as you probably know, childlike pronunciation is different from adult-like pronunciation. There are some ways in which children's pronunciation may not match adult forms. So late acquired sounds, which we'll talk about, are substituted or omitted with different, they are substituted with different sounds or omitted altogether. Consonant clusters are simplified. So for example, the consonant cluster in strength. So there's a lot of consonants in that word. A child likely will not be able to pronounce stra, or inth, and so they might say sainth or stainth, something like that. We also see sequencing errors, otherwise known as metathesis, where two sounds flip places in a word for easier pronunciation. A common one that we see is like paschetti instead of spaghetti. That's like a kind of cliche childlike pronunciation, paschetti, and that's an example of metathesis. So we can see the consonant inventory at age 2. This is now for English-speaking children. Not every child will acquire these exact sounds. For example, the F sound is present in English but not present in Korean. So a Korean-speaking child would not acquire the F sound by age 2. However, they would have acquired different sounds that are present in what will become their native language. So, an English-speaking child by age 2 can pronounce the sounds p, b, t, d, k, g, m, n, f, s, and w. This is a pretty good number of sounds, but it's still missing some important sounds in the English language. There are no voiced fricatives. We're missing the other nasal ng in sing or linger. However, by age 4, they have acquired ng, so now they can also pronounce ng, sh, z, as well as affricates like ch and j, and some other liquid sounds ya, l, r. So this can explain some of the childlike pronunciation we frequently think of. For example, children at age 2 can pronounce w, but they cannot usually pronounce l and r. This accounts for what we really think of as baby talk when people say things like please or I love you. Children really struggle to say things like l and r. this is something that I myself struggled with when I was a child. My mom will talk about how I would always call myself no, because I could not pronounce my L's or sounds. It's especially difficult because my last name has both an L and an sound in it. So when I tried to introduce myself as an infant, it was very difficult to understand because those liquid sounds, the lateral liquid and retroflex liquid, are acquired almost 2 years after children acquire the glide sound w. There are some common patterns we see in children's language or children's pronunciation errors. A common one is final consonant devoicing. So the child devoices word final consonants. So bed might be pronounced as bet. Bib is pronounced as bip. Leg as lek. And nose as nos. Because as we saw on our previous chart, those voiced fricatives are acquired later than unvoiced fricatives. And children generally have an easier time saying unvoiced sounds at the end of a word than voiced sounds. So a common way that children pronounce words is with final consonant devoicing. We also see what is essentially the opposite, and that is initial consonant voicing. So word initial voiceless consonants are pronounced as voiced by the child. So pig is pronounced as big and toes as does. So this is kind of the opposite of word final devoicing. So words or consonants are voiced at the beginning of words. And this is another common phonological pattern we see in children's speech. Gliding is what I was just talking about. So gliding is when an sound or an ol sound is pronounced as a glide w, the bilabial glide. So rock might become walk or wat. Rub might be wub. If we have the final consonant devoicing plus gliding, rub could be wup. And red might be wed or wet. Because children glide a lot, they have a really difficult time pronouncing those liquid sounds. Another difference we see in children's speech that we don't see in adult speech is consonant harmony. So consonant harmony essentially means that two consonants become more similar to each other, even across vowels. So within the same word, children will make consonants more similar to each other with regards to the place of articulation. So tub, which begins with an alveolar stop and ends with a bilabial stop, might be replaced with all bilabial sounds. So tub could be bub or bub. Duck, which has an alveolar stop and a velar stop, could be replaced with all velar sounds. Or tongue, which has an alveolar stop and a velar nasal, is once again replaced with all all velar sounds. So we can see that often those alveolar sounds, which require the tip of the tongue to touch a very precise part of the roof of the mouth, are replaced with easier to pronounce sounds that don't require quite as much precision in order to create. Another common phonological practice is stopping. So word initial fricatives and affricates are pronounced as stops. So a fricative or an affricate becomes a stop. So that becomes dat. This becomes dis. This is very common for children, as we saw in the chart of the consonant inventory by age 4. Even by age 4, most children have not acquired the th and th sound. So it's very common to replace fricatives with stops. Dat, dis, ban, etc. And then the final phonological practice we'll talk about that is common in children is consonant cluster reduction. So especially in a cluster of s followed by another consonant, the child is likely to delete the s. Other patterns of consonant cluster reduction are possible, but it is very common for children to delete an S sound in a consonant cluster. It's not because a child cannot pronounce an S, as we see in soup, but an S plus another consonant may be difficult for a child to produce. So they have acquired S, they have acquired that fricative sound. However, it is often omitted in consonant clusters. So sting becomes ting, sky becomes kai, snake becomes snake, but they can say words like soup. So that's a lot of different ways children can produce sounds that is different from how adults produce them, but that doesn't really answer the question of why. Why do children speak differently than adults? Why don't they just start learning perfectly? Why do children make errors? And there's a couple of different reasons and a couple of different hypotheses. One is just the fine motor control necessary to create speech sounds. As I talked about in our IPA video, the vocal tract is a very complex organ with a lot of moving parts, and babies can barely hold on to things, let alone navigate the precision necessary to make sure that the tip of your tongue touches the exact right part of your teeth or the roof of your mouth, or that your lips come together in the exact right way. However, there's some other things too. One might be just frequency. How often does a child hear a specific sound or a specific grammatical pattern? Ease of production, which we just talked about, and the functional load of the sound. The functional load of the sound essentially means how important is this sound to distinguishing one word from another in the language. For example, vowels carry a very large functional load. Tin, tan, tone, teen, and ton, that's a word, are all different, but the only thing that varies is the vowel. vowels carry a very high functional load and are extremely important when determining whether one word has one meaning or a different meaning. So, sounds that have a high functional load are likely to be acquired before sounds with a lower functional load. Children also are able to produce sounds differently from how they can perceive sounds. We call this the FIS phenomenon. So children can perceive more sounds and phonetic differences than they can produce. So for example, a child is likely to say fis instead of fish. However, if they hear an adult say fis, they'll say no, 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 not fis, fis. Because they can hear that an adult should be saying fish. However, they don't yet have the ability to produce that sh sound. I have a specific example from my young cousin who for some reason acquired the t sound before the k sound. And we were at a family barbecue and someone asked if she wanted, or she said, "Can I have some torn on the tob?" And one of the adults said, "Torn on the tob? You want torn on the tob?" And she said, "No, not torn on the tob, torn on the top." So she can hear that it is being said incorrectly. However, she does not yet have the ability to produce the target sound that she's aiming for. And this is called the FIS phenomenon. Children can perceive all of the sounds in the phonological inventory of what will become their native language. However, due to difficulties in production, they may not be able to produce every sound they're targeting. What does this slide say? I don't even know. Oh. So this is saying that although children's speech is not yet well developed during their first years of life, from very early ages, infants are acquiring a number of skills that will allow them to become proficient language users. So, could language be innate? Could language use be an innate part of human biology? There is something called the innateness hypothesis, and this is the idea that infants are born with a certain degree of knowledge regarding the fact that languages have features, and they are supposed to figure out what these features are. And the set of known features shared by all languages has been referred to as universal grammar. Universal grammar is a somewhat controversial hypothesis proposed by famed linguist Noam Chomsky, which is essentially saying that there is a biological component in the brain that allows humans to produce language. And there's this little core bit of grammar that every human is born with. And then there's also this idea that languages have parameters, kind of like light switches, and children, as they are acquiring their specific language, are learning which switches to flip on and off. So, example, you could imagine that there's a switch that children are born. Imagine that children are born knowing that a language could be subject, verb, object, like English, or subject, object, verb, like Korean or Japanese. And there's this SVO or SOV switch in their brain. And as they're exposed to language information, as they're digesting all this information about the language they hear, that switch gets flipped to say, okay, I am going to speak an SVO language. And it gets switched to the SVO track. And the SOV track is kind of out of the picture for that child. This is called parameters. It's a big part of universal grammar. However, it is quite contested in the language community. There are linguists who believe strongly in universal grammar and linguists who don't really think that it's a thing. However, what we do know is that language is very, very complex, and yet children are able to acquire it without too much difficulty, really. So, some things that infants need to be able to do. Number one, they need to distinguish different phonemes from one another and be able to do so in the context of variation. So they learn to distinguish different speech sounds, even if they're listening to a male speaker, a female speaker, someone is speaking quickly, someone is speaking slowly, quietly, loudly, etc. All the different variation that might be possible in human speech. Number two, they distinguish only the phonemes that are important in a particular language. So there is some evidence or some studies have been done showing that children are born able to distinguish between a very, very large number of possible speech sounds. But by the age of 6 months old, children lose the ability to distinguish speech sounds that are not in their native language. They have to learn what types of acoustic changes are important linguistically and which are not. So they have to learn that just because you speak louder, it doesn't change the meaning of what you're saying. Or because you speak quieter, words still have the same meaning, etc. And they have to be able to distinguish their language from other languages or distinguish different languages from one another. So this is especially important for children raised in bilingual households or even trilingual households. You may have instances where you have to switch very quickly between one language and another, and children are able to do this by a couple of years old. So learn, maybe when I'm speaking with mom and dad, I speak in one language, but when I speak with my teacher, I speak in a different language, and they're able to hold both of these languages simultaneously in their minds. So here are a couple things that babies, newborn babies, can actually do. So even before birth, babies are able to recognize their mother's voice and even their mother's native language. There have been studies done with babies that are literally hours old. And for example, babies who are born to English-speaking parents react differently, react more relaxed to English than they do to French. And the opposite is true for babies born to French-speaking parents. So even fresh out of the womb, babies can distinguish between different languages and can recognize, of course, a baby doesn't know this language is English and this language is French, but they can recognize language patterns that sound familiar to them because they've heard them within the womb. Soon after birth, accelerated language acquisition and development processes begin. By 6 months, they are able to connect words they hear frequently with objects. So they, even if they cannot produce those words, they could hear point to mama, and they can point to their mother, or point to doggy, and they can point to the dog. So even though they cannot yet produce words, they can understand them. And by 8 words, they are able to associate novel words, so words they have never heard before, with novel objects. baby can hear the word apple for the first time at 8 months old and associate it with an apple if they are shown it. So, for a little bit of review, infants and toddlers go through predictable stages of language acquisition. Infants can perceive many more sounds than they can produce, and researchers have also developed novel methods to test infants and toddlers' language perception. We haven't really talked about these methods because this was already going to be a long video, but researchers have produced some really interesting methods when it comes to learning how children acquire and perceive language, even when a child cannot tell you themselves because they just don't have the words for it. So I'm going to stop there because this video has gotten really long. We have not gotten to the development of morphology and syntax, which is how children acquire grammatical rules, but I'll talk about that in a later video, so stay tuned for a part 2. Thank you so much for watching. If you have questions about this topic or any sort of comments, I would love to see them. I hope that you found this interesting, relaxing, or both, and I will see you in the next video. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night.